because we are trying to figure out how to do this for the long haul, then we would be in a winning position. Yeah. It was all new information. So, but this was. Yes, actually. Yes. Rob is very cool.
I mean, there's always the whole like, yeah, we'll make each other. Oh, yeah, okay, that sounds like a great idea. I don't see rolling to that.
Possible. Yeah, well, we'll see. It was too early for them. This was Thursday, so it was too early for them to register it here. So I told the guy that I would put in whatever word he needed with his management for traveling to Bangkok.
Okay.
We are totally cool. Thanks for checking. This is great.
Do you need power, by the way? Because one thing that I noticed about here is that like all the power plugs are completely occupied, and the chairs have no power for laptops. Thank you.
Do you hear things up here while you're doing it?
No, I'm strung across the hallway there. As long as nobody will mind or get tripped, I'm fine.
Okay.
I don't know about Martin.
What are you gonna do, Mark?
I got juice. I mean, I'll be fine.
Okay. Well, I'll make sure when we're ready for the next one, and you know, that'll do.
Boom.
Okay. Hey,
Thank you.
have a great time.
Yeah.
Get wild.
Yeah. Hey, this is pretty good. Good turnout.
You make the room smaller, make it bigger.
This
EKG
is
volunteer to Jefferson.
JavaScript. Okay.
This is a minute taker. Actually, I can start the towards after 9:30. Start the
Did you have someone taking notes?
we know we need to ask your minute taker, but I was going to hand out the
I'm happy
meeting.
to do that. If you want to run the show, I can take notes.
I can do that. You want to swap places, or I just we're fine?
No, you've got power there, so just take the microphone.
Okay, go. So you're going to take minutes. Okay, so let's hand out these.
Unless last, but
It's an IETF fit.
Lorenzo's going to be in DNM scheduled at the same time, so it's not going to be here.
so I've got inroads.
So they might be showing up on the mailing list?
Yeah.
Okay, that'll be good.
Are the blue sheets making their way around? Yes. Very good, very good. Good morning. It's Tuesday morning at 9:30. You are in Capport. Hopefully you wanted to be in Capport. I think DKG has volunteered to be our Jabber scribe. Martin is taking minutes. Let's see. Anything to deal with before we begin? Urgent things? Okay. Welcome to Capport. This is the note well, as usual. Is this the latest note well? I never know. Doesn't matter. Oh.
What's more important is that people understand that it exists and that they have responsibilities. So it has been in the past translated into Arabic without people actually objecting. So go to the webpage, understand your obligations, whatever.
Alrighty. Any agenda bashing? I think actually the not on the agenda explicitly is 7710 bis, but there's the slide after this is about that. So the chairs section may expand from administrivia to administrivia plus 7710 bis and take more than 5 minutes. Any other agenda bashing? Carrying forward? Okie doke. So after way too long a delay, I finally got a -0 7710 bis uploaded. It's missing a handful of citations. I need to find one for content negotiation, but it clarifies that the URI that we're talking about in 7710 bis is the API endpoint. Says captive portals may do content negotiation depending on the accepts header in there. If they don't see Capport or whatever the Tommy, you'll have to remind me what the type is. Application Capport JSON something captive dash API. We remove the recommendation that you should use IP address literals, and we in fact invert it. You should not use IP address literals. And I tried to suggest that we use this URN IETF params Capport unrestricted as a URI thing to say to let clients know that they can just not bother with internet connectivity checks and just proceed straight to getting on. I don't know if this is useful, but it seemed like a way to short circuit or to indicate that you could short circuit the captive portal connectivity checks. There was the question of where additionally this might be made available. In discussions with one captive portal vendor last week, it seemed that the DHCP on-link infrastructure was not always under their control in a substantial portion of deployments. Furthermore, in the ones that they did control, changing DHCP parameters might be seen as exceptionally risky. And so they asked whether the captive portal API could be made, blue sheets, anybody? Okie doke. Thank you. So they asked whether the captive portal API could be available via some means other than DHCP or RAs, given that they wouldn't be able to. I asked if they could deploy 7710 URL options in new deployments, and they said, yeah, sure, okay. But it's not going to deal with the existing deployment base, so most likely, most of it. So could we do something else? And one idea that came up was in the redirect, HTTP redirect of the sacrificial clear text, could there be an HTTP header that said not only location : redirect destination, but something about where to find the captive API portal endpoint? I don't know what people think about this. This is not in 7710 bis, but I do think we should talk about it. I can and fully intend to send something to the mailing list about this. I don't know if you want to talk about it now, what people think about this idea. But I don't know what's required for actually sort of requesting an official HTTP header or X dash.
The Chicago Cable Labs.
No X dash.
So I think we have a slide in the API URL specifically to talk about this.
Oh,
the
okay.
last slide, which is, well, I can give it away right now. It's like it was just using the link header with the link thing, and there's already a suggestion in there.
Is that in the HTML content or in the header?
In the header.
In the HTTP header, okay.
Yeah, it's in the header.
Well, Lorenzo, that's actually it's a great thing because it tells you if a 302 originates from a captive portal or if it's just a 302. So, yeah.
Sounds like we have interest in this. I take it to the list.
Yeah.
Definitely take this to the list. It sounds like there's some value in this, and I think to Darshak's point, there's probably some way to use this in the API potentially as well.
And this should be, if approved, where should this go? In 7710 bis, or should we leave it for the API document? Leave it for the API document. Okay. Fair enough. Thank you. All right, on to the next presentation, I suppose. How do I get out of? There we go. Tommy or Darshak? Do you want the?
Now it is. All right. Good morning, everyone. So I'll be talking about the captive API stuff. I'm Tommy Pauly. Halfway through, I think we're going to switch with Darshak because he has some thoughts on what he just mentioned about how we do kind of the URI, the redirecting, how we handle the URL problem. But before that, I'll give a summary of the latest updates to the API document. So there are a couple of different changes that we've made in the -01. So one is that we have put in all of the necessary IANA registration forms to get our captive JSON type. So application/captive JSON is the one that we chose by a coup. And so if anyone has complaints, speak now. So the text says that the clients should include this media type in their accept header, in their GET request to say, I'm trying to access the captive portal API, and that the servers must mark this as their content type in responses when they are serving up the captive API JSON. So I think this solves the problem of knowing what we're talking about. We also added a section on how we deal with server authentication. And the point of the authentication here is to validate that the certificate on the TLS connection for the captive portal API does indeed match the host name that we have. And so this does assume to some degree that what we are validating is at some point presented to the user in the UI as if it is some type of browser or something about the network you're joining. The overall recommendation is that you should be using OCSP stapling here because the other forms of OCSP that require actually connecting back to some other service or CRL or that those often conflict with the captive portal nature of being captive. You can do it if you want, but that is left as an exercise to the implementer to deal with if they want to go down that road, and they should just use stapling. And we discourage certificates that require AIA. And we also more clearly specify that if there's any certificate validation failure, that the UE should reject and ignore any of the information that it gets on this connection and essentially treat the network as if there is no captive portal API present. That does not mean that captive portals will not work. You essentially fall back to the current stance in which you may get redirected and bad stuff may happen, but it is going to be a lesser user experience than it would be otherwise, and we can live with that, and hopefully people will go forward and correctly deploy their captive portals.
I've got a comment as well. I'm in line.
Okay.
Yeah, I have one question. What will be the behavior of the UE if the host name is not presented to the user? Second line. Assume that host name is presented to the user. Is it mandatory to present the host name or not?
No, I mean, I think we should still be doing the validation of the certificate either way. Like that's a good thing to do. My assumption here is, I don't think this actually is stated quite like that in the document. My assumption is that the value of validating this is that the user at some point can recognize that, oh, this captive portal at least is claiming to be provided by Google or Starbucks or whatever, I don't know. If we're just if what we're validating that indeed the captive portal is owned by evil.evil, there's not a huge amount of benefit to that.
Yeah, but actually, what is the behavior of the UE if the host name is not in the certificate or if not, there is no host name for the server?
I mean, essentially, we're just treating this like any other certificate validation for like a website.
Okay.
Right. Just follow the same logic.
The host name being validated is the one in the Capport URI.
Correct.
Yeah, Lorenzo, clearly that that URL, it's just, you know, an API communications endpoint. You know, do you really need to present it to the user? I mean, what's it? You know, what is the user gonna evince from it? Right? There's no information there that's potentially visible to that the user can understand, and I mean, we want certificate validation for confidentiality, really, but I don't see a lot of value in presenting it to the user.
Fair. To be clear, the document does not say that we're doing this. This is my comment on the slide.
Yeah, so Martin Thompson, I'm making notes and trying to make comments at the same time. The text in the document and your text here, I think misses the key point a little bit. The important thing here is that we have a long sequence of interactions, and the first one is with the network, and we kind of know that it's with the network because it's DHCP or an RA or something along those lines. But beyond that point, we're exposed to all sorts of attacks and whatnot, and we're limiting the attacks from that point onwards.
So that this validation essentially is tying the thread between the different points to.
Yeah. So when you do certificate validation in TLS, you do that for basically, particularly with HTTPS, you do that for one reason, which is so that you can say that your expectations with regard to the identity of the thing that you're communicating with are met. And so we establish those expectations when we get the RA or the 7710 URI. And from that point onwards, we want to make sure that no one can violate those expectations. And so that is what is being provided here. That and the fact that we're following all the standard best practices for doing HTTPS, and we like the confidentiality, and we like the fact that it's using all the same tools. All of those things are great, but fundamentally, the security property that we're looking for here is that continuity of expectations and actually meeting them.
Right. Very good point.
This is DKG. So I appreciate the view from the network, like reasoning about the chain of network events. But the reason that we're validating the name is because when you connect to a given network and you think you're connecting to the Metropolitan Transit Wi-Fi, you want to see that the user needs to see that it is the network that is the Metropolitan Transit Wi-Fi.
Right. Which was kind of the point I was getting to here. That is a way to go, right? To say, like, if I join the Starbucks captive network, that something to indicate that, oh yes, this portal is brought to you by the thing you're expecting to connect to is useful.
And if we do that via showing them a web interface where you can put the Starbucks logo, like, well, sorry, but I can put the Starbucks logo on my home network. And so I absolutely agree that if the document doesn't say, you should put that as a should for the user agent. If the user is interacting with it, the user needs to know the name of the network that it's connecting to. If the user is not doing any interaction whatsoever, then you don't show the user anything. But they have to be not interacting with it on the basis of something that they have maybe interacted with in the past. Like if this is wifi.starbucks.biz, then I'm okay, right? But there needs to be some linkage between the user's mind and what they're doing so that they know what networks they're connecting to.
Right. That's kind of the direction I was going down here. I do think that we do need to clarify what the point that Martin made of the linkage, because that's kind of the fundamental thing for the API, linking with the rest of the architecture. But presenting something to the user is a good way to make sure that if they join something just because the SSID looked to be like the thing that they wanted, that they have some level of confirmation that maybe there is someone with authority behind this. Warren.
No, Warren was before me, but I'm going to go after Warren.
Okay. So Warren Kumari, I'm still a little confused. When I go to the Sheraton and get on the SSID that's called Sheraton Guest, what actually connects me is something called Room Links. Like they've outsourced that to Room Links. So I don't really know what I'm supposed to be expecting here, right? Like Sheraton Room Links, who's these people? What am I supposed to do with this information now?
Forensically, I mean, this URL just comes from like an entirely untrusted source, right? I mean, we can say, oh yeah, like from the point on where we get this URL, which is basically anyone on link can send it to us, then yeah, we're going to validate that. I mean, sure, but I don't think, you know, maybe you could say, I don't think you can even say, well, let's check that it was the one we got last time, because this stuff is, as Warren says, it's outsourced all over the place. You know, there's things, you know, there's this SSID that I connect to, and it's got, you know, it's called Hills Wi-Fi, and depending on the venue, it's provided by a different operator with different captive portal policies. Right. It's sort of kind of luck of the draw, really.
There's an interesting deployment question, because this is not the same as the page you're redirected to.
Right.
So you could even have the page you're redirected to being a different entity than the one that's providing the API. Maybe the one that's providing the API is closer to what you would expect, and they outsource the redirect page, or it could be completely the opposite way
Can we
around.
restrict them to the same host name, so that, because the user will see that one. If they log in to the network, they will see in their user interaction page, they will see a host name, right? You present it, don't you?
Yes, I believe we do.
Right.
But
so-
either way, I mean, you could also present, like, I mean, if we're adding API support, we could also present that in that same portal.
But where in the UI? You present two URLs?
I don't know. That's not my job.
Well, but you know that the people whose job it is
Yes.
are going to be very hard to convince to present two URIs, right? So, I mean, what do we lose if we make them be the same host name?
Potential flexibility of deployment.
Pierre Fister. I think the point is not whether you want to present the host name to the user or not. The thing is what was said before, that I would disagree with you, Lorenzo, that when you connect to the network, you sort of trust the configuration information that you get from your network. So DHCP arrays or PVD, you somehow get that URI that tells you that there is a captive portal API, you have to connect with it. And when you connect with it, it's a good thing that you can use TLS to validate that the thing you're connected to is actually the one that your network told you to connect to.
The one, right, the one who is screwing with you by making you captive and giving you this captive information one is the same one who sent you the RA, the DHCP. Yeah. Like they're in collusion. You're proving that they're indeed in collusion. Yes.
So, Capport Cable Labs. So I think I'm going to address, I think, the point that you made, like, if we make the API host, the host name the same as that one, we lose probably a lot of actual practical deployment scenarios, I think. Because the thing is, it is very possible that the captive portal API URL may be hosted by some other entity compared to the one that's providing the user page. And not
it may
only
not
that,
be the same host.
They may not be the same host. And the second point is, even if, let's say, the host name may not be apparent to the user, so the user connects to Sheridan and thinks that, oh, it's from some on-link, something else, that's fine. At least you have shown it to the user, right? And then let the user ask the question or decide if they still want to continue or not. We should at least put a recommendation of saying they should show it to the user.
So, Martin Thompson, I think this is a difficult problem. And even in the case where you think that you're connected to Starbucks and it looks like Starbucks, it might not be, because we have this problem on the web where the thing that is presented to you doesn't always match expectations. And the reason that's less of a problem on the web is because you establish expectations in how you type things in, how you get to them. We don't have that property here because essentially the network can send you anything. Correct. And it's very, very easy to use confusables and all those sorts of other things to basically fish in this way. And that's not necessarily a problem in this case, as long as the primary properties that we're looking for are maintained. However, there is still some value in having this continuity and TLS all the way, because you have the ability to do things like, well, okay, so I've got a password that I use with Starbucks. And now I'm under attack. It looks like Starbucks. But now your password manager will recognize that this is a different origin and not feed that password in. And if people are using those sorts of tools as they should, then you avoid some attacks. The problem with taking TLS out of the link at any point in this process is that you open the door to all sorts of interesting problems. And I don't think we need to go there.
Right. And that's an interesting point you bring up, because if we eventually do evolve the captive API into something that doesn't just require user interaction on a web page, and then we can do some more automatic rejoining of things, then yes, certainly the fact that we're validating this will help us reuse whatever credentials we had from previous sessions.
I don't think anyone has suggested not using TLS.
Right.
No one has said that. What I think DKG said is TLS is worthless unless the user sees the name. And part of me agrees with that, part of me doesn't. But if we want to do that, I would really challenge people to say, okay, so what deployment scenario do we have where the party operating the captive portal login page is not the same party that would be operating the API server? Because I can see how the venue page is not going to be the same page, but the entity that is making you captive or not surely should be the same entity that's that's powering the API. No.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
You've seen all of David Bird's presentations on this stuff. This is
But
really complicated.
Yes, I agree it's complicated, but those. Yeah.
Okay, so for those people who haven't seen those presentations, and it was probably a few meetings ago, he showed some of the ways in which these network architectures are built up behind the scenes. So you just see a Wi-Fi access point and something happens, and what it shows is that you have, you could probably find that one. It's IETF 99.
It's in our chair slides.
Oh, it's in the chair slides? Do you want to switch to that? Yeah.
If you don't mind coming.
No, so please.
The concern there, I think, is that people who build the overly complicated hotspots, if they see any impediment to doing these APIs, they're not going to deploy this thing, and we're not going to get any benefit from having defined these things in those networks. And we're already at the point where this is a big ask for these guys to deploy. And you see the picture here. The portal and the website are sometimes different.
I'm not talking about the partner website at all. That has nothing to do with it. That was exactly my point.
Which one is the one that's being shown to which one are we getting redirected to today that's being normally shown to the user?
My understanding, limited understanding, is that the page that we're redirected to when we have to log in is the thing labeled captive portals. It's my understanding.
Okay.
Now, my limited understanding is if you clear that captive portal, you end up on partner website, generally speaking. And so,
so you're saying require the co-location of the API service with that portal?
Yeah. I mean, we should, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
We should check whether that's actually a cruel and unusual burden, right? That's the point. It may be that it's not, because I definitely see this separation between partner website and captive portal. But
can I ask what you think you're gaining by adding this restriction?
well, I was trying to address TKG's point about the user actually, because the user will see that login page. When you log into the captive portal, they will see that. Otherwise, there's no portal. Right, because if they don't see, right, like by definition, if it's a captive portal, it means that the user sees the login page.
Right, but doesn't that simply mean that the operator of the network needs to ensure that the page that the user ultimately ends up seeing is one that they will trust?
I don't understand that question.
So you could imagine, I think, let's say that my API host name is different from my portal host name. And my API tells you where to go for your portal, and maybe it sends you to something that looks good, but it itself, as the API server, is some hostname you would not expect, and maybe potentially redirecting you.
So as a concrete example, I go to the Starbucks. The mechanical details of all of this has been offloaded to some other provider, and so that provider manages all of the plumbing. But they send you to a portal page that redirects and redirects and redirects, and ultimately lands you on a page that has the Starbucks origin and shows all of the nice things that you might expect to see. Underneath the covers, the thing that's being presented to to over 7710 or over the API could be anything. And we're sort of seeing here that there's a bunch of websites involved in this process.
I see. So you're saying, basically you're saying that Capport portal could log, the initial redirect, we couldn't, even if we enforced that the first 302 got sent to the same URI, it's the same host name as the API. The initial
The API
302
could
might
be like
just
over
lead.
here. You might just bounce off that and not into something else, and it would just be an
So
unnecessary
the user would
restriction.
never even ever see that anyway.
Right.
So this is DKG. Let me just clarify why I think it matters what this is. If we are envisioning that this is something that's going to provide smoother, more seamless access for future connections, then the user may actually never see the captive portal page on subsequent connections. And so that captive portal page may never end up showing up, which means that whatever your client is doing to decide to navigate you through this without you having to face the captive portal is going to be keyed to something. And what it's going to be keyed to is this invisible thing in the middle that we're talking about validating. And if that's actually invisible, then what you're saying is the, evil.evil can ultimately point you to starbucks.wi-fi. And then you go into starbucks.wi-fi and you think you're going into Starbucks, but whatever registration setup actually happens there gets tied by your endpoint to evil.evil. So the next time you go to evil.evil, you end up connecting there, even though you thought you were authenticating to starbucks.wi-fi.
Right.
And so whatever the user is going to see needs to be visible. Now, I agree with Lorenzo that these things should be the same thing because showing the user two different names is on top of the ESSID is confusing and users will not get it. So if the goal here is to communicate something to the user, these things should be tied together.
Right. You could imagine that if they are not, then the UI highlights that in some way. Another place where this could be represented to the user, not to go too far off track, for example, in the list of what Wi-Fi you're associated to, because this is actually potentially a longer lived thing or something that's happening automatically. So essentially your captive portal SSID could be annotated with, captive provided by this. With even potentially like a way to like drill down into that and see, here's the properties that we're aware of on this network that look like captive portal properties.
Kyle LaRose, just one quick thing. I don't want to make sure we don't lose sight of this, but we're not solving captive portals only for Wi-Fi networks. We're solving it for wired networks, cellular networks. So it might not be something you explicitly connect to.
That's fair.
If we have a button, if we have an affordance in the UI of any sort to let the user connect to the login page after the fact, then maybe there's going to have to be some space.
Or to see how much time they have left or whatever.
Oh, the time. Can I? Oh, is that in scope for this presentation? No. Because
probably not. We can let's probably jump back to the normal slides and just clear out the presentation. Let Darshak talk. All right. This is very interesting. I think we should probably have more discussion on the list as well.
Take it to the list.
Great. So these are just a couple questions or comments that have come up from the list when we got some reviews of the document so far. One of the things that I think needs to be further emphasized in the document as it stands is that the list of keys and information currently provided by the JSON API is not exhaustive. Some of the comments were like, oh, this is a fairly naive approach of saying, oh yeah, you have a UI portal, you have the potentially remaining time, potentially the remaining bytes. I think we fully recognize that at this point, this list, especially the optional values to have the remaining time or the remaining bytes, is a bit of a straw man, and it does need some more nuance there and potentially extensibility. We can see that just being something that we discuss in this group as we are working on the document to clarify that, but we probably also want some mechanism by which people can extend the keys that they're putting in this JSON format. So I don't know if we have thoughts about the appropriate way to do that.
do you explain, Jason?
Maybe we could just define new keys. If you have proprietary keys, people can put whatever they want in here.
You mean like bring it to this group?
Right. Essentially, is there a process in which, someone, like, do we have extension documents in which people just define new keys? I don't know.
JSON bits with blobs of HTML to also please display on that page.
You
Does
want a registry?
Yes, right. Like, does this need to eventually become a registry is
So you're
a
basically,
question that came up from this.
so you're basically saying, do we need a registry? And if so, should the procedures for adding that registry be standards action or expert review or like
Right.
email Tommy? Or
Right.
yeah.
Right. That is potentially a direction that this takes us down. And so as a working group, we will need to think about that if that's something we want to do. Yep.
Well, I mean, it'll be like, I don't think we'll survive IESG review if there's no extension process, right?
Exactly.
So-
Right. So
so yes, we
it
have
is
to do
something
it.
that will need to be a fix that comes in a other version of this document. Great. The other thing that came up, I think, based on David Bird's comments were, what are some of the edge cases? What are the failure cases here? So just to review, I think how the document and the API stands today. If everything is working and essentially you are advertising a captive API on a network that is truly captive, then everything is hunky-dory. We have a pretty good user experience. We know where the portal is. We don't have to deal with redirects. We can make sure we present it to you. And then the two failure cases are the cases in which maybe someone's advertising a captive API on what would otherwise not be considered a captive network. This is an interesting question that was brought up. You could imagine this potentially being a good thing in which, this network has given you extra portal information without blocking you, just to give you some user experience, but it's also, an invasion of the user experience without potentially adding too much benefit. We've decided, is this a harmful thing? Do we need to worry about this? And then the other edge case is that someone is not advertising the API correctly on this captive network, and that's essentially what we have today. It's also equivalent to having an invalid certificate on your captive portal API, and we just fall back to existing behavior. Warren.
There's an extra edge case, which I don't think is captured by the bottom one,
Okay.
where it's an incorrect captive API listed. And I don't quite know what happens then.
It's like,
But
so
then do you
the
time out
server
first,
authentication works out, but it has nothing to do with the thing that's actually blocking you.
Or it just doesn't answer. Like it's listed, but the captive portal API server is down. Do you time
Well,
out? Do
okay,
you
sure.
panic? Do you?
Right. I mean, if it times out, I think then we essentially fall back to existing behavior. Well, so what you imagine is that this thing is governing the behavior of like what we consider to be like the captive interaction, like the sheet that pops up. If someone goes into a browser and just tries to load a page, they may still get redirected or get the other behavior. This is talking about what is governing system behavior. So maybe it does delay the system automatic behavior.
Kyle Rose, regarding the second one,
Yes.
I could see a nuisance portal that just you go to log in, it's like, no, too bad, no. And then what does the user equipment do? Does it just give up, or does it fall back on old behavior?
Right. Well, especially if you aren't actually being denied access to your traffic. This is, I think the thing that comes out of this is we maybe shouldn't, disallow you from joining that network. Like we should make sure that your browser traffic can still go through if it can. Right. That we don't prevent that.
Or do we want to wait? I mean, do we, with maybe a timeout, because we don't want to just let it go through immediately, because then it'll just get redirected if there is a captive portal.
I think there's non-captive network could also be a captive network that's currently logged into, right?
Correct.
So I would say number 2 is not really a configuration error. I mean, I think
That's my thought as well. Like it's just, they're giving information. It could be a nuisance. In which
Could
case, well,
I suppose if you do 7710 and then you could like,
if you're just trying to essentially pop up a random URL into the user's face, that can be a nuisance.
if you can, I mean, if you get it from, If you get it from the 302, then that nuisance is basically shares fate with the nuisance that you pop up the login page anyway.
Exactly. Right. And in some cases, I think this is potentially somewhat useful because there are some services, let's say like on airplanes, in which I want that landing page because I want to know how far my flight is along and all this other cute little information. But maybe I am already allowed to use the network. And so how do I get back to that page, et cetera, et cetera. So this solves that.
So it also provides perhaps an incentive to the operators by providing a UI affordance to learn more about the network or visit the venues page.
Exactly.
So I don't know, it seems reasonable, I think.
Yep.
All right. I mean, this does also feel a fair bit like it might be abused, that every time I join a network from now on, somebody's going to pop up a shiny website for me offering. I mean, I guess that currently is kind of a thing that captive portals do anyway, but it feels like this might make it easier to pop up a, did you know that we now have Blarg on sale?
The fact that we have a captive portal API and that we join the network does not necessarily mean that we have to pop up the page, right? Because if we are aware that we're already logged in, hopefully we do nothing. So the question is, if they lie about being logged in, what do we do? Right. Right. That's true.
Everything, and what I will say is basically the same thing as Lorenzo said. If we were throw two anyway, we fall back to this case. But displaying an URL could also be a frame of 1 pixel by 1 pixel outside of your viewport containing of style, JavaScript or whatever. But it's the same thing as 302, right? Anyway, so nothing new there.
Should we not do 7710? And only do?
No. No.
You need to do 7710 if you want to support case number 2 there, right?
Right. I mean, there is value to having knowledge about the state of your captive portal without relying on redirects. Like part of also this allows us to not do probes, right? Because the redirect relies on something that can be successfully redirected. Precisely.
So, Martin Thompson, just in response to Eric's point there, the fundamental premise of the web is that you can do that safely. I mean, if we fail at that, as we often do, that's on us as those people who provide the browsers. But there's nothing much we can do about it. And yeah, we've already established the fact that they can do this anyway. So
great. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Darshak just so we can talk about how we can avoid using 7710.
All right. So I'm Darshak Thakur. I'm from Cable Labs. So I actually had some text also that I was supposed to publish for this, but I wrote the text and I didn't like it, so I didn't publish the text. But I think what I wanted to try to do was just kind of throw it out for discussion and see what people think about it, and then we'll see if it makes sense. So we sort of had a discussion about this at the last IETF. I think Tommy brought it up in terms of what should 7710.2, right? And so what we are suggesting here is it can be like, let the network operator choose what they want to publish in 7710 or any other equivalent mechanism, right? It's their choice. What we provide here is, if they are already advertising a captive portal URI in 7710, then we already have the user portal URL key that will point to the user portal, and the user can, and the UE can actually find that. If they want to advertise the user portal, then we register in the API document or maybe in the architecture somewhere, we registered a link header with whatever, some link relation, we can figure that out. And that one, captive API, whatever, right? And that one points to the captive portal. So if the user actually gets to, if the UE actually just goes and receives an actual portal URL page, it can still look at the link header, it can still find out that there's a captive API URL there. So you actually have kind of a connection both ways. And then we don't have, benefit is we don't have to decide if we want, what we want to do with 7710. We may still want to fix 7710 for other reasons, and that's fine. But at least with this, we just give a suggestion and let the deployer or the network operator choose. So, and let me see, was there anything?
So
I guess I already
just
covered that, yeah.
clarification that this would also work with the 302 redirect,
Yes.
the sacrificial one.
Yeah.
You would use that. You could use that in the same context,
Correct.
and you would get the same information in the same way. Yeah, because I guess the question would be, if the user ends up on a page after a long sequence of redirects, which one of those redirects had the link relation
Link
attached to it?
relations, yeah.
And so I guess the answer would be, well, any of them.
Yeah, exactly.
That may be a problem.
We can discuss that. Yes, that's a good point. So
Warren Kamari, let's say that I join a normal network, there's no captive portal, and I connect to the internet and I browse around for a while. And then eventually I stumble across evil.example.com. And it includes one of these links saying, please go along and use this captive portal API and come back every 30 seconds in order to make sure that you still have, time remaining. And now for the next, 3 weeks, everywhere I go, I'm happily checking in and telling them where I am.
this is part of like the current UE is when you get redirected to a captive portal, knowing that you are behind a captive portal. This is for those URLs to advertise it to that, not. So right now in the UE, right? How do you actually, whatever mechanism you're using to load up your special, you're doing your probing, and whatever mechanism you're using to find your special page is where that is the entity that's supposed to provide this the URL back.
So I would suggest the answer to Martin's question is which of those 302s. I would suggest the answer is only the first one. And the first one is essentially the same tofu model that the DHP URL has. If someone's able to manipulate your on-link traffic, then they get to choose what you do.
Yeah.
So Warren Kamari, I think it's also, but it would have to be also not just the first 302 that you see, but you can only do this for the first few seconds as well, because, right, you might connect and not see a 302 for a long time.
Well, if we do the sacrificial probe,
yeah,
then
but then you've defeated the whole point of all of this.
I really don't hate the sacrificial probe. I really don't care about it. We do it anyway. We're going to have to do it till the end of time, pretty much. I mean, from an implementation perspective as well, the sacrificial probe's already there, and in our implementation, it happens to be an entirely different component from the one that actually displays the login page, which we don't display unless the user actually interacts. And so there's a difference in terms of trust model there as well. So
Eric Kinnear. So just a point on the captive probe. If you're on a portal that then later becomes captive because your time expired or something like that, I don't think we can guarantee that you always have a probe that's going, that is going to come back. So you may hit a redirect sometime later for some totally legitimate traffic. If you have it, but yeah.
Have it, yeah.
It's mandatory in this case, not?
No, it's not mandatory, it's optional. And even this one is kind of an optional. It's a should or a option available to the network operator. So.
Speaking of which, so option C, choice. Choice is good, but it increases testing burden, and it provides opportunities for misconfiguration, which
agreed.
B seems restrictive in the sense that I tried to argue for that about 20 minutes ago. I was like, no, that's too hard. So that I think that leaves us with A. Is that right? I don't know.
Well, so A is something. The question would be A would be something we register it, and then it's up to, we will still have to provide some deployment or some security guidance around when the UE should actually look at it, right?
So I think the trust model for the HTTP redirect is different from DHCP in ours. It's not tofu because many hops off link might interact with whatnot. We would have to have some guidance for this link relation saying that browsers were not really supposed to do anything with it except pass it off to an operating system component for subsequent evaluation.
Yeah.
Is that kind of thing that happens? You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. I understand what you're saying. I think what Lorenzo was saying was something different, which is that you make a request with an expectation to be receptive to receiving one of these things. And when you are receptive to one of these things, then it has meaning.
Yeah.
In every other context, so
Yeah,
browsers
no.
in particular would just look at this and go, huh, link relation, like they do with all of them, just about. And that's fine. And I think that's actually a property we like it out of this, which is that unless you're specifically looking for this information, you're not going to do anything about it.
Correct. I think that's really the intent here. I think that's, yeah.
But what about the idea of having a possible mechanism at the operating system level where browsers could say, I observed a captive portal API link thing. You might want to decide if that means I'm captive again.
Yeah.
So, does that make any sense? So we have a mechanism in Android, basically, that apps can report, I don't have any working network connection. Please check it out for me.
Yeah.
And we redo the captive portal stuff. And sometimes the captive portal is back, and sometimes their server is gone.
Oh, yeah.
But we handle it.
Yeah, I think.
Tommy, just the conversation about having a very, like, the specific probe that this is a connection in which I'm trying to detect a captive portal, and I only want that response I only want to use that response if I'm doing this. It makes me concerned that, if we add the definition of the link relation and someone just sees the definition and they see it come back and they don't read that part of the document, that, they could end up doing it in the browser and not at the system level. But does this mean that if we're doing our captive probe, should we add in like the accept header for the captive API JSON?
Yeah.
Like essentially like do a probe for the API as an accept thing to like when the other side detects that, it's like, oh, this is apparently what you want to get redirected to.
So it's, yes, I think.
Why not?
Yeah. So you get your, if you're doing the probe, right, you get your probe, and if the probe response, if you're getting a 302, right, you can choose to interpret that and go to that URI and find out if there's anything you want to use from there, right? And that would be
but
the
essentially,
API
like,
URI.
define that like a captive probe has this format and is trying to accept this thing.
So, Warren Kumari, I mean, maybe, but the thing is, at the moment, a lot of people spend a lot of time trying to figure out what the captive portal probes are and do special handling for them with whitelists and blacklists and things. If you now include a thing being like, hey, this is a captive portal probe, they've got less work to do. This may be a feature or a bug.
Kyle, the point earlier about only using the link relation if we think that we may have lost the captive portal is interesting, because it means that we use the link relation if it comes back from a probe, and then any other time we only use it if we had previously seen one from a probe. We can make that kind of the logic. So
Yeah.
the OS is aware that we're in a captive portal from it having it previously. It kind of breaks down when you look at cases where maybe the captive portal starts being enforced later on, or it's being used for some other purpose or something like that. But
So I think that was one of the reasons why I probably didn't even put the push request, because as I started writing it, I mean, this actually literally, apart from just, I guess, registering the link relation, we will probably have to have a huge section about deployment guidance or, security consideration, something somewhere, either in the architecture or in the API document. I don't know where the right place is. If we do decide to even consider this.
Wherever this mentions, it'll need to be considered in the security section.
Yeah. So. All right.
Thank you. Thank you. Our 10-minute API update, and
That was a great discussion.
been here for an hour. It was well worth it.
Okay. So we have tons of time for this meeting, but I'm hoping we don't use it. But Kyle, no pressure.
Wait, forward. This is great. It's forward. What's this about? Yeah, we'll find out.
I'm Kyle Rose from Agilicus, and I'm going to present just updates to the captive portal architecture between now and, the 02 and 01 version. Right. So first, I'm going to summarize the changes. I'm going to talk a little bit about the signaling protocol we've introduced, and then just finish off discussing some open issues and questions that have come up on the mailing list or in the GitHub repo. So what have I changed? Well, so we added the requirements so nicely provided by Lorenzo for the signaling protocol. We sort of stripped out ICMP, or we did a set and replaced, ICMP with signaling protocol for the most part. And there's a bunch of typos and spelling mistakes because I was dumb and didn't run it through a spell checker. I fixed those. All right, so the signaling protocol, as I hinted, it's very similar to the old ICMP workflow. It's just we've replaced it with an abstract concept called the signaling protocol. Define some requirements for it so that when we go to actually implement one, well, we'll know what to do. Just stepping back a second for context, the last IETF, there was a bunch of debate about using ICMP to signal that you were captive. And correct me if I'm wrong, but we decided that rather than try to solve that problem in the architecture document, we would sort of just describe at a high level what we want that protocol to do, and then make it optional so that we could actually deploy captive portals without it if we need to, and then finally move any specification of it into a separate document. Okay, so moving forward, so the requirements, you've read the document, are essentially that it's not easy to spoof, so you can't just have it coming from randomly on the internet. That you can send it before the portal closes to inform the user that there's a pending expiry. And those are sort of the two main ones. Another one is that there was, I hope I didn't misinterpret you, Lorenzo. There was minimal information in the message. That means that really keep it simple, just give enough information to the user equipment to make the decision it needs to about whether or not it's captive, whether the stuff's going to expire, etc. I added some requirements around being able to identify the source of the signal in order to validate it later. It's debatable whether that's actually necessary, and I think I'm going to discuss that a bit at the end of the presentation. And finally, I added a requirement about it not needing to be reliable. And I wanted people who implement the protocol to be aware that it's not a TCP signal necessarily. It could be something like ICMP, or it could be something like a UDP packet, and that they should be aware that it might just get lost. And if the user equipment keeps on trying to connect, keep trying to send the message. If just be smart about it.
Lorenzo, so from after having talked to friendly captive portal operators, I'm sort of grown to be worried about the ability to send this before portal closure, particularly if such a signal might result in UEs presenting to users some plea for attention. I was actually wanted to make a comment about your draft where the expiry time, and my fear is that we can't have nice things in the sense that if there's an opportunity for a captive portal operator to say, your time left on the clock is 3 minutes and 20 seconds, and so we would if we dutifully present to the user a notification, 1 minute and 30 seconds in, and show, hey, click on this page to stay logged into the network. They would do that as often as they are able. And so my fear was that we would be forced to tie the expiration date, the time left on the clock, to actual expiration, in the sense that we'd have to run a probe and determine that we were actually locked in again before we would honor that. So I don't know if this fear is justified or...
Well, could we do something to mitigate it? Like, the UI experts put a snooze button on it and say, you know what, I hate this thing. Make it go away for a while. Okay, Tommy shakes his head.
Tommy, Polly, Apple. So for the expiry bytes or time in the API, my thought was not that one should prompt at all. But for example, like if you had a page that was like, oh, here's your network settings, you could have essentially say, the network said you have this much time left. Here is a link to the portal. If you want to, of your own volition, click on it. And if you say, oh yeah, that 30 seconds is bogus, then you won't do it. But essentially it's, I paid for an hour. it's a way for the system to handle the clock for me.
So it could have like a countdown going or something.
No, it can even just like keep a clock. So I could have this window open, like they actually do this on a lot of captive portals, like on an airplane. They'll have the countdown timer if you leave that window open. The point of this is that could be a system level window that says they reported this countdown timer. Here it is if you want to see it. So I'm more okay with that than I am with having the signaling protocol be able to do this, because it could continually change its mind, and it can essentially pester you with this a little bit more. You could represent it in the same way, but if we have an API, I'm not sure what the value of a signaling on the wire is before portal closure. Because like, how long before portal closure should that come? And so even if it's not necessarily pestering the user, are we encouraging people via this mechanism to pester the radio on the device and just send packets to wake up the device and say, hey, you may be about to close, and the user doesn't care, and there's no point to send that traffic on the wire?
A few things to say in response to that. So what was I going to say first? Crap. So regarding a portal pestering the user, I mean, they could do that right now. Why don't they? Right? They could just keep sending redirects every 3 minutes. I guess the difference is that it actually...
There's collateral damage if they do that.
Okay, and I guess it's a little more impactful when it's actually interrupting the connection as well. So, I think the idea with the signaling protocol was that it's potentially more reliable, and that it's coming from the thing that's actually making the decision. That was one of David Bird's big points, is that if you make all of the decisions centrally, it's a lot harder to misconfigure, a lot harder to mess up. So maybe that's part of the reason behind it. Regarding there's a little blurb in the draft talking about why we have that, and it's to make it more seamless, so you don't lose connectivity first. So maybe rather than you could, I guess it would be up to the UI to decide. Okay, well the API said we have 10 minutes till expiry. Let's maybe do something in 9 minutes.
So yeah, I guess I was going to make something similar. Captive portals can currently do this, and some of them do. But it seems that having an ability to at least signal, you should come back and look at the API, please, would be useful. Because I mean, some captive portals, you sign up for an hour, and the timer starts now and continues running for 60 minutes and then stops. Other ones, you sign up for an hour, and then if you decide to leave the hotel and go to Starbucks and get some coffee and come back, the timer stops. And when you reconnect, having you should come and have a look. You thought you only had 15 minutes left. You now actually have 45. We could also agree that the user will only be annoyed if the timer, you should probably log in again, if the timer says that it's less than 5 minutes, or maybe something that the user sets. So, they could keep saying like, come look at the API, come look at the API. But if we don't do anything with that information, they've got no incentive to send it. Maybe.
So I don't think there's an incentive for the captive portal operator necessarily to ask the user to go to the API. Right? The only thing that appears to me to be an incentive for the US operators is to show the user stuff. Everything else is cost. And so I think if we get prompted to go to the API, even if it results in us, burning packets, I don't see a lot of harm. And at most will update our idea of what the JSON values are, including perhaps time left on the clock. And if those don't actually result in, pleas for attention to the user, then maybe that's fine, right? To Tommy's point, we just update our clock with our new idea of what the clock is. So, but that was one of the points that I think we'd made in Chicago, I think, was it? Where we, or maybe London, where we said, look, this should be a hint to go to the API. It should never be a hint to do something else. It should always be, hey, something has changed, go look at the API. And I think that removes a lot of the incentive, the negative or the wrong incentives here.
So I'd appreciate if someone reads the text in the draft just to make sure that I've captured that correctly. I think I did that, but if there's any wiggle room in there, we should try and lock it down.
This is DKG. So I just wanted to ask that we think clearly about the sort of power structures that we're putting in place here. And I tend to agree that providing the signaling protocol to happen after the fact puts a lot more power in the hands of the network operator. And if we say that you only get this during connection, then the network operator basically has to state something and then stick to it, right? It negotiates something during the registration phase. I might be using the wrong term there, but right during the phase where the user interacts with the captive portal, and it's committing to something that the user and the user agent is going to keep track of and will do the right thing appropriately. Now, if you want to, during the negotiation phase, tell the user, I'm going to register you, but only for 2.5 minutes, so you'll come back and look at an ad in 2.5 minutes, then the user can say, this network is not functional for me, and be done. If instead it says, sure, go ahead, I'm registering you for an hour, and then it comes back 2.5 minutes later and says, whoa, you got to check it out, something's changed, then I think that's a problem. And so I think this is something that will be more useful to users if the negotiation, if the network operator knows that they have to stick to the negotiation that they've made with the user at the registration time.
What if when we, in the API, we are a little more strict about changing the timeout, right? If it's also, it's like this weird discontinuity in the remaining time when you go and visit, it indicates something's wrong, but I mean, you go and what's the damage of going and visiting the API again? Aside from cell power.
API is different from the web portal.
So that was Lorenzo's point, is that we need to make sure this is a signal for the headless portion of the protocol.
My device has a limited set of resources, right? Mm-hmm. Whether it's my brain or whether it's my smartphone or whatever. That's battery, that's radio, all of that, right? When the network comes back to me and says, hey, I need you to do this thing, you're burning my resources. And if I've negotiated with you that you're not going to burn my resources for the next, X amount of time, unless I'm choosing to do it, I want you to stick to that.
So, Pierre Pfister, so given that we have an API, we are designing an API portal that it runs on HTTP, that it's trusted. So this looks a bit insecure to me to rely too much on such a signaling protocol. So for me, it would really be useful in case there is some synchronization issue between the API portal and the network for some reason, load balancing in the network, some device went down and up again. And so that can happen. So in my opinion, that shouldn't be more than just an ICMP error message. I don't see why it would need to happen before portal closure. Like the network shouldn't have to keep track of who's connected, and that's up to the API portal. So yeah, when you send a packet, that packet has to be dropped by the enforcement point. Yeah, it seems fair that it would send you an ICMP message telling you, oh, you're captive, and you should probably go to the API portal that you already should know the URI for. Like the URI should not be in the ICMP message, otherwise it's an attack vector. And I would be fine with that would be an information. If you actually get such an ICMP message and your connection is running fine, why would you do anything? So if you don't want to visit the API portal, just don't. If your network is evil or somehow wants to block your connection, you don't really have a choice. You have to go to the API portal. And if the network wants to exhaust your resources based on that, it just can.
So Warren Kamari, I think that there is some incentive for people to play funny games here. So unless, and I don't quite know where this goes, maybe architecture document, I come along and I join the Fairmont network, and it pops up a captive portal, and then it says, you have access for 47 years. You should come back every 30 seconds and check. Or they use this to signal come back and check. Now I go to the Hilton and various other hotels and Starbucks and wander around, and the whole time I'm checking in for the next 47 years to tell them exactly where I am. So we need to make sure that the captive portal information stays scoped to the network that you actually join, and that's not actually, I don't think that that's actually written in the document. It seems common sense, but
no, it's not.
Open an issue on that one.
Yeah, thanks.
Lorenzo, I think we have to accept the sad reality that there is no enforcement of anything that is in the API at all, right? Because the user doesn't see it, and therefore they can't keep anyone honest, right? The only thing that, so to my point about, to the earlier point about, well, we should only do this on initial signaling, there's nothing in initial signaling that makes this remotely trustworthy at all. The API is just there for, information, and you can't trust any of it. Because the user is not in a position to enforce any of it or to keep anyone honest. So I don't see, there's a lot of ways that networks can use your battery. They can send you packets and they cause you to drop them. And something on your device will wake up when you do that. Even if it's just the chipset, it still does wake up. And so they can flood you with packets. They can do all sorts of stuff. And I think if we don't give them incentive to do that, it's just going to be more trouble than it's worth for them to attempt it. So I don't see, so if all that happens when we do this ICMP is we hit their URL and ask for JSON, then we're just they're just imposing costs on themselves to do extra SSL handshakes for no benefit. Because we update our idea of the timer that's left on the clock. We don't do anything else. Particularly if we don't show anything to the user, they don't care. So.
Tommy, Polly, 2 points here. One, just to what Lorenzo was saying, you could imagine that if there is information in the API, like expiry time or something else, essentially the moment you get through the portal and we're like, hey, we're good now, the system could give a summary of hey, you've joined this network. It says you have this much time left. And that is the opportunity at which the user says, but I paid for an hour and you say I only have this. So it's potentially a way to confirm. Is that useful? Is that spoofable? Sure. The other point, kind of based on what Pierre was saying earlier, I'm not totally sure about all the deployment models, and someone like David Bird would be able to help with this better. But when we're looking at the indication before portal closure, that assumes that the thing that is giving the signaling, like ICMP, is aware of the kind of the long-term state of these and when it's going to close. I could imagine an architecture in which the thing that is sending the ICMP or the redirects simply just has a whitelist and a blacklist or just a whitelist of these are the addresses that are allowed to get through, or the MAC addresses or whatever, to say, okay, on or off. And it is some other entity that actually is doing the countdown of the time and just essentially updating a rule list somewhere else. So it may be difficult for the same entity that is giving you the signaling of you're blocked, to also have the nuanced notion of, and 30 seconds or 2 minutes before this person is about to be blocked, then go give them some other update.
So, I mean, I think that I put it in the documents that it's a should, not a must, send a signal. Sure. And that's a good reason to have it as a should, not a must.
Why would we even send before portal closure, right? If we are absolutely 100% creating an incentive, if we're going to present that to the user in terms of a Capport portal login page, it's going to be a disaster, right? Because they're just going to do that every 20 seconds. Right?
I think the idea was to try to allow networks to signal issues back. Maybe
that's what destination unreachable is for, right? No.
But an issue might be, trying to consider there were some people in here a while back talking about the telecom use cases where something you're infected with a virus and they want to tell you that you're infected with a virus. So right now they're just sending you a 302 redirect to a random HTTP access.
Or that you now qualify for Comcast Business Access if you only sign up here for.
So I don't know if we want to explicitly de-scope that sort of use case, but right now, as far as I'm aware, it's still on the table.
So let me summarize a conversation that we had with a apparently quite competent Capport portal operator, right? The only thing that their customers wanted, the only reason why they were providing free Wi-Fi at all was that they got to show the user a page at the end of the Capport portal sign in, okay? And they hate our guts because we closed that page as soon as they unlocked the portal, right? So they were basically saying that makes it entirely useless to us. From that, I did use that. Really, the only thing that basically we get free Wi-Fi for user retention. And I think we need to keep those incentives very well in mind before we allow, the network to signal user attention. It's basically, and I think literally, yes, captive portals can lock on you today, but what they do is they cause themselves collateral damage because, UEs can switch away from their network, and it also provides irritation to the user when they're browsing and they get interrupted. And it's a disincentive for them. If we just give them a free incentive, then they're going to use it.
So Warren Kumari, I think that's exactly my point, is that users don't like it when their captive portal suddenly stops. Like the destination unreachable as being a good signal. I don't like that idea because I'm on a FaceTime call or Google Hangouts call with my wife, and suddenly it stops and dies in the middle of an argument, and she figures I've hung up on her. Oh yeah, all the time. So I would much rather the network signals, this is going to time out in an hour, and the system just ignores that. It's going to time out in 10 minutes, and the system ignores it. But I've said, please let me know 2 minutes beforehand, right? So we could always have the device decide that it's going to ignore all of the please pop up a message until, 30 seconds before or a minute before.
And then they'll just set it to 3 minutes.
Then they might as well just set the captive portal timeout to 3 minutes as well, right? It's the same amount of, like, if they're willing to pop up and make themselves be annoying, they're willing to pop up and or just make the timeout that much less.
If I may, Warren, sorry, I inserted myself in the queue there. It might be that you could get your time remaining warning from the system because it got it out of the captive portal API and not from destination unreachables. Yeah. And one very hypothetical thing I would put to the room for consideration is, what if we just stick with the existing ICMP destination unreachables as the enforcement thing when they want to shut connections down? We remove signaling protocol altogether and replace it with a recommendation that operating systems provide a mechanism for applications to request reevaluation of network access. Basically, operating systems should provide a report bad network or a please check the network for me call that applications can use when they think something is gone amiss, possibly a capture portal.
But then it still is going to break my video call or something, right? You're gonna have to break it before the app notices.
Only if the capture portal is lying about how much API is lying about how much time you have left, or it forgot. Yeah. Bear in mind, right? It's entirely possible that a capture portal enforcement point might reboot, it completely lost state, and then really you're just toast again, right? So
the earlier thing of they can just keep popping things up. The reason that captive portals don't currently set a 1 minute timeout is because users will get annoyed and wander off. All I was suggesting is the signaling thing, we could ignore it until we think that there's only a small amount of time left. Although that breaks, when you lose state. Okay.
So why have it at all then?
I'm an idiot. I'll sit down.
Every 30 seconds, right?
So Pierre, basically just repeating what has been said already. Sorry, it was just said before. It looks like ICMP destination unreachable is the thing that we are looking for. We could add a new type, like UR captive type, to give a little bit more information about the reason why the packet was dropped. Not mandated. I mean, if an older router wants to use the destination unreachable for some other types, might make sense. And Lorenzo, it looks like what you're looking for is that in the architecture there is a requirement that says that based on the time that is available on the API, the user equipment should never be mandated to connect to the API before that time. So when you log into the portal, you pay for something for some time, and that time should be the one that's given by the API, and you shouldn't have to connect again and again and again every time you get an ICMP message. That's what you're looking for, I think. That's what you ask for, Lorenzo, to make sure that the host doesn't need to do more connections than what the API asks for. And if the API says, oh, you're only allowed for 30 seconds, what do you want to do? Yes, sure, you will have to connect to the API every 30 seconds because that's what the captive portal lets you do. Or you want to mandate that shouldn't be less than 1 hour?
personally, I don't care about, like, I can hit the API every 5 seconds. No one's going to make me do that. No one's going to care unless there's an incentive in the form of like annoying the user with an ad. And in that case, I promise you they're going to do that. And that's the thing I'm trying to ensure here. I don't care, if we get a signal hit the API, sure, we'll update our counter because our clocks might have drifted. I don't know, who cares? No one's going to ask us to do this unless hitting the API is actually going to result in us annoying the user. And like I said, my fear is that we can't have nice things.
Yeah, but just like you said before, if the API just gives 30-second leases, it's going to annoy the user enough that it's going to hate the captive portal service, and it's going to wander off.
And my point to that is, like I said, we can't have nice things, and so even if it says 30 seconds, we're just going to ignore it, right? I mean, like the only way I see around this is Tommy's suggestion. It says like the summary says you're now logged in for an hour, and then the user might get pissed off if it locks before then, in which case, right? If we get told to hit it again after 12 seconds, and it says like, yeah, you're actually now logged in for 2 minutes. What do we do, right? And my point is, I think we have to design this with an adversarial mindset, right? And so, like I said, I don't care if we hit the API every 20 seconds, because no one's going to make us do that, because it's just like it's going to increase the load on their server, and they're not going to do that, right? So there's no point. There's no attack vector there. The attack vector is in terms of user attention.
Dr. Thakur. So I think maybe I'm missing it, but I think I just wanted to point out that when we talk about the either captive, you're either logged in or not, I don't think logging in is actually always a binary state. You may be like, when you connect to a captive portal, you may say, like, okay, you chose the free low-speed connection, right? And if you try to connect to Netflix, it's going to block you, right? It's like you're not allowed to stream Netflix, with the current settings that you have selected. So how do you I just want to make sure that that is a reality, right? Is like, how do you account for that?
I'd encourage people to take that one to the list. The discussion about selective blocking of services is an interesting one, and perhaps not something that we don't have that on the agenda.
Can we get rid of that topic forever? Here's my suggestion.
Okay.
We start a thread on it. There's a massive argument. We declare that there will never be consensus, and then we drop this topic. Please,
I'm happy to do
I
that.
can write like impassionate emails. I can like rail at people, risk being banned from the list, and like you can do it as well, and you can do it as well. And then we have this great argument. Say, okay, there's no hope of ever reaching consensus on this. Let's declare it out of scope forever.
So my understanding was that we wouldn't engage on this topic for that reason. If people think that I'm wrong, come and talk with me privately. But my understanding was that when we built this, the expectation was that any such information of that nature would be left to communication between the network operator and the users using the captive portal pages or what have you, and we wouldn't provide any specific mechanisms in support of those sorts of things.
I think the problem comes when we have a mechanism that seems to offer some benefits, but also has some downsides. But then one of the possible benefits that is really strong for it is this use case, and I guess we just need to strike that benefit from consideration if we're going to.
So I wasn't necessarily
or at least for
suggesting.
now, yeah.
I wasn't necessarily suggesting that we need to do anything about it. All I'm saying is we at least need to account for the fact that that's a reality, right? And whatever we recommend in here has to at least say something like that could happen, and you do blah, right? We don't deal with it, but we at least have to mention it. I know we're not going to get any consensus on it.
Okay. So you're suggesting that we need to at least address the issue, even if the way that we address it is to say that we're not going to address it. Okay.
So, Warren Kumari, I can't tell if this is part of that third rail subject or not. I get on a United plane and I connect to the network, and it gives me automatically the pretty thing that tells me how far the plane is and streaming from their internal, thing of movies versus connect to the internet. Is that a differentiation of service or no? Because one sort of behind the captive portal and one isn't, right? Like, I get internet, but the internet is very limited to just the stuff on this plane.
I mean, you might be able to argue that, if you draw some boundaries that, you think about it, like literally it's on the plane with the captive portal versus not on the plane.
Yeah, I mean, I think, okay, so to the earlier point, this is the reality of things. It's also a reality that we can't write anything unless we get rough consensus on it. And certain topics, there's just like no point in discussing them because we know they're not going to result in consensus because we've had those discussions recently and frequently, and we just end up with the same conclusion. We can't write anything unless we agree on it, is the point, right? Do you think we can agree? I think we can agree. That's my point. Yeah. So my feeling is that we are forced that we will only be able to agree on a model which has essentially a binary captive state and stuff that's inside the portal and that's available regardless of whether the portal is unlocked or not, and the internet, right? And I think, we can probably agree on that. I don't know. I don't think we can agree on anything else. So we might as well say, look, it is out of scope, and because I don't know. I don't know if we can say there's no consensus, or we could say, look, it raises. Isn't there some IAB document that we can point to, or something that's already written down that says we're not going to engage in this topic because blah.
4084.
Yeah. Tommy Pauly, I agree that we should not engage in the raging debate that Lorenzo proposes, although it would be really fun. Yeah, exactly. I appreciate that. I think the one thing this brings up to me is that while we should be designing for the internet or not use case, there are captive portals that do partial blockage today. So I think we should have as a requirement to ourselves that any solution that we come up with, which is less bad for internet or not captive portals, is also less bad for the other ones. So doing something in our architecture or in a protocol that actually limits or harms those use cases in ways that we don't need to make those use cases much, much better, but we need to make sure that we don't make them worse. What I'm concerned about with the signaling, let's say if we did have, this is not what you're proposing, but like an ICMP error that every time I get an ICMP, you're captive or unreachable or something, that then I actually pop up the portal webpage to the user or something. That is something that will not work for a walled garden or a partial scenario because that inherently assumes it's one or the other. Because I may have done everything I can possibly do or want to do with the portal, and I'm still blocked on Netflix. And so the fact that Netflix gives me an ICMP or some signal should not cause me to do anything more, because that is potentially the good steady state. So that's my concern with the signaling protocol, is that if we're assuming that some signal that you're being blocked by a captive portal implies that you need to go and do something more, is I think an incorrect assumption. The reason I like the API more than the signaling and more than even today's redirect model is that it truly separates them out, right? It says there is a path, and the API is not about enforcement. As we were going on with David Bird on the list, API has nothing to do with enforcement. It is only a bootstrap for user experience. And I think that's actually what we're trying to solve. The enforcement model is not something actually I think we're trying to change here in this group. We're trying to change the way that we interact with the portal to allow the user to get to what they need to do, which is the network's problem.
But I mean, the signaling protocol is an interaction.
It's a hint.
It is a hint, but the question is, what do we do in reaction to it? And we could get to the place where in reaction to being blocked, we do exactly what you would do on a non-captive network, and you got a destination reachable. Like, we don't have to do anything different.
I just want to make sure I understand your point. So regarding Netflix and steady state. So the idea is the user, they've connected to the portal, they've chosen their plan, and that's it. And they know that Netflix isn't going to work, but for some reason they have a window open and it's just trying to connect to Netflix in the background, and they just don't care. So why would you pop something up? It's just going to annoy them.
Exactly.
If I may, well, go ahead, Lorenzo.
If Netflix doesn't work, it's an outage, right? If the user expects that outage, then that's fine. I mean, I agree with Tommy. I think, and also, I don't think there's anything we can do about these partial connectivity use cases. We certainly can't make them worse, because they're just going to be, the operator's just going to continue to do whatever they need to do in order to enforce their business models, right? We can try to make other stuff better. We can't try to make this stuff better because we can't agree on it. So we can't make it worse. We can't make it better.
I think in the case where the user paid for, the non-video streaming service, right? I don't understand what will be gained from a protocol to tell them you're going to Netflix and you could pay more if you wanted to. We have the API for the URL. For the user interaction, if they wanted to go back, there should be a path in the operating system to say, I need to go back to that interaction page because I decided I want to upgrade. We have that because the API gave it to us.
I guess the one nice thing would be if the failure was a little more explicit. Just more that rather than it just hanging and waiting, or my SSH connectors fail randomly, it just fails. And then that's where maybe what Eric was saying earlier, I think it was Eric who said it, that the ability of an application to request the OS to validate the network. It's like I kind of like that.
But for if it were the Netflix app, you would get the answer. Yeah, no, everything's fine. You're just not going to work. But so Warren, Kamari, maybe this is already covered, or maybe it's too much UI. But what's often happened to me is I've gone along to a hotel and I connect to the captive portal and it says for free, you can get internet access at 1 meg. For $9.99, you can get it at 10 meg. Like, I don't want to pay 10 meg, $9.99. So I get the free one, and then I discover that was not a good option because their 1 meg is not actually 1 meg. And then I can never actually find the captive portal thing again. So it would be really nice is, I guess, if this is a UI thing or something, where I can then click on a button and be like, what was that URL again? Because I'd like to upgrade now, please.
That is, the API gives you the user interaction URL, and we can provide an affordance
Well,
UI. Like
yeah, that's it. And we should please provide the
Yeah, but it has nothing to do with this.
Yeah, I really don't see the issue that we have right now. Like, if the user tries to connect to Netflix and that's not provided by his service, there is an ICMP return message. It doesn't hang out. The connection is just closed because there is the ICMP error. You can display it in the browser or whatever, in whatever way you want. If the ICMP message actually is you are captive, then you can display you are captive. And then the user is supposed to click somewhere in his system that tells, okay, actually I want to upgrade, or and reach back to the GUI. I don't think there shouldn't be anything automatic, and I think we all agree on that.
Lines are clearly not sort of, well, mostly related. We encountered a captive portal where the user signed into the messaging plan, which included, I don't know what, and we know that it included Google.com because the Google search app was telling us quite regularly that they had connectivity. And then there were the other apps that were telling us, and we do have such an API to report internet connectivity. There were other apps that were telling us, we really don't have connectivity. And unfortunately, the probe that we do for internet connectivity includes a random element, and some of those were 302'd and some of them were not. And so we ended up, and the bug that was filed was, I keep getting prompted for access, but I already signed into everything I signed into. I wanted the messaging plan, get out of my way. I don't know how to fix that, but yeah, so, and I don't think this would help, to be honest, right?
So I think we've run that one to ground, and there seems to be pretty strong consensus about this one. I think the conclusion there was that we're not making things worse, and I put an issue in on the architecture draft to simply state explicitly what we're doing and what we're not doing with respect to this sort of use case. And I think that'll be relatively straightforward to do. One paragraph should be enough for that sort of thing. But it'll mean that we can close this issue in the sense that we actually have an artifact that says what we've agreed. And so if anyone wants to produce that one paragraph, I welcome that. But otherwise, that's on you. So
You've written it down already.
the notes are not that good.
So I'm moderately confused. I just want to make sure. Did we agree that there should be no signaling protocol at all? Or did we agree that there should be?
Not on that question. We got sidetracked onto this other more interesting question.
I thought we agreed that it was going to be a hint.
Yes.
Okay.
At most, it's a hint, which is, I think, consistent with what's in the draft.
Okay.
So
And should
we confirmed
result
that.
in refetching the API?
Could.
May. Okay.
Okay. So I probably need to rephrase that.
I'm with May. Okay, fine.
I'm getting the impression that people will make their own decisions about whether or not they want to go and get the API. Yeah.
All right, moving on. Okay, so some open issues and questions that aren't the ones we've been talking about. So there was an issue open saying, hey, we need a way to indicate that there is no captive portal so people can just go on. Eric has that in the draft. I think you actually answered my question on GitHub today. And I think I noticed in the API, no, in the PVD document, there was also a note about it. Yeah, oh, sorry, slides. Yeah. So I think probably can just close that issue. There was also something, we had some language in the draft talking about PVD. And now that Pierre has nicely provided one, I'm assuming it gets adopted. I think I can probably just clean that text up and get rid of the issue. There is a section talking about the backwards compatibility of signals. In particular, it's talking about how a portal might choose to continue to do redirects as well as do signals. I think, I don't know what we want. I'm not even clear that that text makes sense anymore, given the discussion we just had. So maybe I'll just, I can strip out that whole thing, or I can try and clarify it a bit more. I think I need to think about that one a bit more. It's not clear to me what the answer for that is. Maybe I'll take it to the list a bit.
What does this section give us except an opportunity for disagreement? I mean, I don't disagree with it, but I don't think it also provides a lot of information. It's like, yeah, you could do this. Sure, of course you could. And also saying you should implement this RFC in the RFC itself is like, right?
Yeah. You must.
So,
if you read it, you must implement it.
So, yeah, if there's the hint of disagreement on this, I'd say just strike it.
All right. There was some discussion at 101 about the accept field and backwards compatibility. There's language in the architecture right now about that. I'm not sure it really should be in the architecture. So I'm thinking of just removing it and delegating that to the API/DHCP documents. All right. This is my fault, or yeah. Anyway, it's the author's fault. We said in the workflow there's a section about verifying the plausibility of a signal or ICMP message, and I'm not sure plausibility really makes sense. I mean, what does it mean for it to be plausible? So I suggested on the mailing list that we rename it to authenticity. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but it raised a point that I didn't really capture very well in the draft regarding the requirements on the signaling protocol. We didn't really talk well about having the security of it, like having the user equipment trust that the signal is a real signal. There is a requirement saying that it's hard to spoof. Do we also need a requirement saying that it is real? Whatever that means.
So before Tommy speaks, we've talked about the nature of the signal, and I think we've established that this is not necessarily a requirement here. And so saying something particularly with a should is problematic in the sense that you're now contradicting yourself.
You may implement the signal, but if you do, then you should.
So, what I was going to suggest actually is that any protocol that provides a signal like this will have certain properties with respect to authenticity. Being on the path is maybe not the property that we're looking for, but that's something that ICMP provides some information on. We don't have a lot else, and so we could do the whole HMAC thing that we talked about before and whatnot. But
That's what I was trying to capture here.
the question is, I would not put any specific requirement on this one based on what I've heard.
So I think maybe just a little too restrictive. Let's just keep the option open if you want to, but just
Right. Let's leave that problem for someone else.
Right.
Future me can deal with this problem, basically.
So Tommy, the point came up here to make was that the requirements around authenticity of signaling are intimately tied with what we are using the signaling for. And so if we do what we were discussing here of, it's a hint that you may use to tell you that something went wrong, which is I find to be exactly the same as a normal ICMP unreachable today. It doesn't really seem to require any more authenticity because it's exactly equivalent to the unauthenticated signal we have today. And we should try to do nothing. Like my concern is if you try to add a signaling method with authenticity, that implies now that I have more of a should, that I should be using this to validate something. I should be trusting this and doing something with the user, and then it gets into the whole can of worms again. So until we actually have benefit from the signal that's going to be a strong signal that carries more than just a hint, we shouldn't add authenticity to give the impression that it does.
Yep, makes sense.
Pierre-Pister. So if we keep calling it a signaling protocol and not ICMP unreachable and try to speak in general terms, it seems important to me that there is some text about the properties of the spoofing possibilities. Like, okay, if you imagine that signaling protocol that can come out of the blue from anywhere, anybody that knows your source address, even though it's a hint, that's going to be an issue, that anyone can send you that, your captive signal from anywhere. If it's an ICMP unreachable, and that you need to make sure that it comes from the path and that it's related to an actual connection that you're having, it's a little bit better. Just a possibility would be, in the API, there was the HMAC possibility that can be done. We can also imagine putting a list of valid source addresses in the API that, not strong security, but still better than accepting such messages from anywhere on the network.
Lorenzo, how likely is it that we could get rough consensus on this document if we removed all of the signaling text? Can somebody not live with that? I mean, in this room, and do we believe that somebody could not live with that on the mailing list such that we would not get rough consensus? Or rather, enough people would not live with it that we couldn't?
Pierre-Pister, I think there will be cases where there will, bugs going on between the API and the network. And as I said before, I don't want the page to just hang forever waiting for something to happen. It's good to have some message from the network saying, I'm the network, there is something wrong, please, reach the API or ask the user to do something, or, at least inform the device that there was something going wrong and it's because of the captive portal.
So that's another question.
Yeah, I think so. Because I think I can't.
So, Warren Kumari, I think removing everything about signaling might be a bad thing, but saying signaling is out of scope for now. We're planning on writing a document in the future to deal with it. would be perfectly fine with me. Or, there may be, somebody may one day write a protocol that does this. But like at least showing that we thought about it.
So where would be the appropriate spot to place that note? Would that be just in like
introduction, something?
Right.
So just as a suggestion there, that suggests that maybe you could lighten the requirements in the sense that they could be a little bit more abstract and a little bit more a little bit shorter, and not go into these sorts of details in too much at too much length, but still say, this is what the role that would play in the architecture, but we're not really describing a concrete manifestation of it. The following things are probably important, like the spoofing thing, but we don't need to get into the details and the nuts and bolts of it, because that's very hard for us to do right now because we don't know what this thing concretely looks like.
Yeah, especially if it's like these things are probably important, not the signaling protocol must have the following requirements or things. Because
I think we need to at least have some statement, and I think probably at least some level of character. It doesn't have to be requirements also, right? It can just be characteristics. Like it should ideally have these, these characteristics, and that might be okay, but at least we should have some.
So when we're going down this path of considering shrinking the scope of the signal more, does that right now there's a fair amount of text describing how the signal actually works in the workflow. If it were there, would that also involve just removing all of that, remove from the diagrams, and just have a brief blurb saying, hey, we would kind of use it to talk between the enforcement point and the user equipment, kind of look like this?
It's probably not the right room to be having that discussion without actually having the text in front of us and the time. So my suggestion would be that you and those who are interested go back and have a look at the document, what you've got at the moment, and make some suggestions on what might be done.
Right. Can I make a suggestion? That's what I was planning to do. Would anybody disagree with this? So we just say that the network, the enforcement point should, or maybe must, when it drops a packet, send the destination unreachable ICMP message. So just like we make sure that something happens and not the packet is silently dropped.
That's a separate question.
Really?
That's a separate question. But please, we should talk about that. But right now, this is about the trigger for going and fetching the API and the requirements we have around that. That's a separate thing that maybe we should talk about. I'd like to get to the answer on this one. Are you happy taking an action to look at the signaling stuff and seeing what you can do to reduce the level of detail, perhaps, and maybe come up with a proposal?
Yep.
Okay.
Should we also say that, or clarify that, for better or worse, suitable or not, ICMP destination reachable is the signal that exists today?
That's the question that I think we can now move on to.
Is it actually used today?
Look, can we just close this one before we move on to that one, please? Tommy, you wanted to go on the next
close.
one?
I wanted
Okay.
to talk to that.
Does anyone have any objection to that plan? Kyle's going to go and have a look at the draft and look at the signaling stuff and remove the landmines of this nature and try to get it down to the essential parts. And I think you're close, but you've got a lot of detail in there, and we could probably just lighten that a bit.
Yeah.
All right, Tommy. So to not solving this problem, but more to going what Pierre was saying, one thing we could say, and you can take this down in the notes, that I think could be helpful is just silent dropping is considered harmful. And that's it, right? Like if you have some mechanism that will produce an error and cause the connection to be closed or redirected or whatever, that is preferred to black holing traffic. And then we can just stop there.
So the suggestion from Lorenzo, and in case anyone missed that one for the record, is yeah, you should generate invalid SSL certs. That's a great must. In preference to dropping the packet, perhaps that's actually not that bad.
Especially if they do.
Okay, one final thing, and I don't have that on the slides, but there was a question raised on the list or a point made by a couple of people that they felt the architecture needed a bit more detail in terms of the role of the enforcement device. I'm not sure. I mean, I thought there was enough, but if people feel that we need to call it in more detail, be a bit more prescriptive in terms of its functionality, I'd like to hear that. I'd like to hear any suggestions about what I should say that I'm not right now.
Lorenzo, feel free to ignore me because I'm going to say something not very helpful. And I think my feeling is the value that we can provide in this group is in terms of a protocol to try to help clarify some sort of contract between two different devices. It's really not, I think, that useful in this group to tell captive portal operators how to build what they've already built. So, you know, if we already have text and we agree with it, sure, but if not, I think that's not the value necessarily here. So, you know,
it's possible I
so
misunderstood.
saying, oh, the enforcement point should or should not do this in pursuit of a signal that we don't even agree how it's supposed to work. I don't see a lot of value in that.
So Warren Kumari, and I think that this is properly on this topic. So enforcement stuff. A while back, I was wandering around with an Ubuntu laptop, and I really wanted to reach google.com for some reason. So I opened up my laptop and I connected to the captive portal, and I didn't have any internet, and I typed in google.com, and sure enough, it sent me a destination unreachable, which my machine decided was meant destination unreachable. And then I paid for the captive portal, and I could reach everything other than google.com. So we should be very careful with making sure that, you know, what signal we send back or what is suggested and what one actually does with that. Yeah, turns out clearing a destination unreachable that the kernel's learned is kind of tricky, and rebooting is the right way.
That is not good user experience. Okay, so to Lorenzo's point, if we talk, it should probably be the case that if we talk about the, be more descriptive than prescriptive when it comes to the enforcement point. We're just give descriptions of how we think it's working in order to illustrate the main things we're doing, which is the protocol. All right, I think that's it.
Yep.
Any closing thoughts?
Thanks, Scott. Okay. We have a little bit more time.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, we use our time up. If we continue at this rate, we're going to run out of time. So.
We had a captive portal that told us how much time was When the session stops, captive API tells you.
Oh, yes. So, hello everyone. I'm Pierre Prisser, as you probably noticed, and I'm going to talk about. Thank you. I'm going to talk about this new draft, which is about discovering the captive portal API with using provisioning domains, and so it's co-authored with Tommy, who wrote quite about everything in the documents, but I'm presenting it. Thank you, Tommy. This is not something totally new, the concept of provisioning domains. It was defined by the MIF working group, and we discussed it quite a lot in this working group. But now is the opportunity to have a deeper look at it, since there is an actual document to look at. So it's defined in the architecture document RFC 7556 as a consistent set of information. Basically, this is the set of things that you receive from your network that lets you access the network. Now we have an additional draft, the provisioning domain in the interior working group, which has two main objectives. The first objective is to identify the provisioning domain, and for that purpose, we use a fully qualified domain name, which means that if you're connected on one interface to one Wi-Fi, you would receive some notification telling you the name of the PVD, so it's a fully qualified domain name. And on another interface, another provisioning domain. You might have multiple different provisioning domains on the same interface by the means of different router advertisements, meaning that they would have different fully qualified domain names. Or you could even have the same provisioning domains on two different interfaces if they ultimately connect you to the same upstream networks. Like for instance, in a hotel room, you get Wi-Fi and wire, but in the end, the upstream connectivity is the same. It's the same service that is provided with the same characteristics. So there is, the idea would be to let the host know that it's actually the same service that is provided. And now the second objective of the provisioning domain work is to provide additional information about the fundamental properties of the upstream link you're connected to, the way you access the internet. So that can be, you know, the service provider, the name of the upstream connectivity. It can be, for instance, we are going to talk about it, whether or not there is a captive portal. It could be the throughput. So we are not right now currently defining all that in the draft, in the provisioning domain draft. But the idea is to provide something that is generic by the mean of a JSON object that is provided to you by the network, and that lists the different properties of the network for the host. So the idea in this draft with this additional object is to do something that would be generic and that would serve multiple purposes. So for instance, the one of the captive portal working group, in all the cases where the host would know a little bit more about the network, but it might be considered slightly, you know, annoying to define a new array or DHCP option for every use case. So not saying that that working group shouldn't do that, but we have lots of cases where you would like the host to know more about the network and that you don't want to have to define a new IPv6 ICMP option to do that. So for the phase one, the way it works is that the fully qualified domain name is put in the router advertisement packet that you receive from your router. So in this example, you have two interfaces with two different routers, but as I mentioned, you may have a single router with multiple PVDs. And so this is the option that has been defined. You see, so there is, on the middle of it, there is a PVD ID, so that's the fully qualified domain name. We have a set of bits that are set or not. So the H bit is the one that is pretty important because it stands for HTTP bits, because it means that based on the fully qualified domain name, the host is allowed to create an HTTP request to retrieve the JSON object, which you can see on the other part on the bottom of the slide. So that's an example of a JSON object that you can get. The other bits are the L bit, which is for legacy, which means that the provisioning domain ID is applicable to the IPv4 connection as well. So it's compatible with IPv4, although it requires a router advertisement. So you can say that the PVD works for the IPv4 uplink. And then we have other fields like whether or not there is a specific router advertisement options that are included in the PVD ID. So you can play with the options that you want the PVD aware host to be able to parse and those that you don't, but that's not really the topic for today. There also is a delay field that lets you avoid thundering herd problem when you want to update the PVD. Now for the JSON object, the keys that we have today are the name. So you can display a fancy name to the user. There is a localized name, so you can display a fancy name in the language of the user. We have a time of expiry such that from time to time you can update the JSON object. No, that time shouldn't be really often, right? Because it's really about the characteristics of the link, and those are not intended to change all the time. So the JSON object can be seen as something that is pretty stable over time. We put a prefix in order to validate that the JSON object that you receive from a server that I didn't mention it yet, but we use HTTPS. So we validate the fact that the server is actually owning the name that is inside the PVD, but then that wouldn't prevent an attacker from advertising a PVD ID that is not that it doesn't own. So there is as well the prefix there to make sure that the PVD is used on a network which uses the same source addresses and configured addresses. And then we just have an additional key for saying if there is internet access or no. But that's not what we are going to use for captive portal. It's a bit different because this internet equals true or false is really a fixed property. So in the case of a captive portal use case, it would be actually false, like you would have internet access, but there is a captive portal. So in that case, in the captive portal case, the key would be kind of absent here. So implementation status, it's been implemented for quite a while now. We have a daemon that helps the user space application to get information about the object. There is a patch for the Linux kernel, but right now it's not upstream. Obviously, having the RFC published will help with upstreaming the kernel modifications. We have IP route change, Wireshark dissector, array DVD for and ODHCPD for OpenWRT. So just one slide to talk about captive portal. No, it's really simple. We are just proposing to add an additional key in the JSON object that you get from your network. That additional key is called captive API. It gives you the URI of the API such that when it is present, the host would know that it is captive and that it can connect to the API to log into the captive portal. So really, really simple. Basically not anything more to say about the actual proposal for the captive portal working group. And just to mention that it's that simple that we actually implemented it twice in 2 different hackathons. So that was IETF 101 hackathon, we implemented it and demonstrated it. And then it was IETF 99 hackathon. Yeah, Lorenzo?
Yeah, keep going.
So final slide for discussion today. 4 main topics, I would guess. Whether we should add an additional key that kind of shortcuts the API to go to the GUI faster. So that's one possibility. Should we define a way to state that there is no captive portal? So that would be as simple as putting, an empty string instead of the API. Then we can discuss the pros and cons of using PVDs. Should we use PVDs only, or should we use DHCP and array only, or should we use both? And finally, just tell us if you think this is useful, if we have to keep working this direction, or if you think that the option with the array option and DHCP options are sufficient to the working group.
Another thing, actually, another question was, which we, I don't know if we've considered that in the API doc, is what if this URL changes? Because the PVD has an update mechanism. So what should happen if the captive API URL changes during the lifetime of the network? That's another question to ask. As for whether we should use the array or DHCP option, well, PVDs are v6 only, right? So for v4, no?
They require arrays. They require arrays, but what defines, like Eric Vink, I was about to say this, if you don't mind jumping in the queue. Indeed, it requires an IPv6, but what defines an IPv6 networks are end host, not network. As long as Android, iOS are there and listen for IPv6 array, it works. The URL can be fetched over HTTPS over IPv4. The DNS request or CSP can be done over IPv4. So it can be done everywhere.
Let me amend my definition of v6 network. It requires that the network operator send arrays. All right, so
Yep.
it won't work on a v4 only network.
Okay, so
Okay,
can we just assume that by the time this is specified, the routers that are in the wild are able to send arrays?
All right, so all right, so okay.
As for
my initial advice would be to say, well, let's use 7710 for v4. We could consider using this instead of adding 7710 to v6 if we wanted to. Given that, like, in real captive portals, v6 or in most of them, v6 is, one of those, yeah, we have no plans for it right now. So
it could be an incentive.
Really? Okay. Okay. So that was, yeah. So maybe we can just say, okay, we'll use 7710 for V4 and this for V6. I don't know, because otherwise we have two ways of doing it in V6. But
I just answered your first question about API URI that could change, right? Yes, so there is an update mechanism in the JSON, in the PVD specification. Not going into details, right? But it's push based, just like the array. So you can just push the updates to the hosts.
Tommy Pauly. So partly as co-author, but also speaking just from my being in the working group, my answers to these questions, and other people please agree or shoot them down. For the first one, should we have a direct, essentially a shortcut of the API? I would say no. Extra methods are kind of extraneous, and it kind of ossifies on one current deployment model. That's why we left it out for now. The second one, based on the 7710 BIS document that we have now seen, which we did not have earlier, I would argue that they should be the same string for marking that there is no captive portal, because that already defines one, so we should just copy that. That seems natural. As far as the coexistence with 7710 BIS, the feeling I have, at least today, is that they can live in harmony, that there really doesn't need to be an either or here, because 7710 BIS has a great property of being very simple for the simple deployments, and it seems like a slightly lower barrier to entry for those things. And if that can help captive portals, that's great. And I think the updates to 7710 BIS are taking in the direction that we want to go, and they solve the problems with the original RFC. There are benefits to having a PVD. So first of all, if you have a PVD, this feels like this should be a property of your provisioning domain. It's a natural thing to extend. So like, I think this is good work for this group to do in order to extend that set of available information, and that should be specified here. It adds value because if we're seeing a world in which you actually have multiple uplinks, this provides ways of getting more nuanced deployments of captive portals. So like, this could actually be the way that we solve the partial captivity problem, because like long term, right? Like if I have, one PVD for my streaming work, one PVD for this, and I actually am using different v6 prefixes, they have different captive state, et cetera, maybe they all point to the same API. They have different APIs, but they could point to the same user portal for actually buying the things. But then we actually have multiple PVD states associated with different captive portal APIs to maintain the lifetimes of the different services that you've bought. So I think this is useful work to keep doing. I don't think it's going to be the most common simple deployment that we're going to see in round one, but I think we should have them coexist, and like, yeah, let's adopt both documents and their different use cases.
you can't both solve the multi-payment scenario and use 7710 BIS at the same time, because those two things will stomp on each other and they'll race.
Correct, right. These would be separate deployment models, but like an Android or iOS host would understand either. And if you want to use the one that lets you give different subnetworks, great. If you want to just have the one that's just like the boom, here's your RA DHCP option, that works too.
Which one supersedes if they differ? Is there different?
I think that would be up to the PVD document to describe. Like a PVD aware host prefers the nuanced PVD one. I don't know. Like that's something that we would need to discuss if we were to take on the work.
One option as well is that if there is an array option that is defined for discovering the API, you can put it in the array with the PVD. And if you have multiple services, different services, you can send multiple PVDs, multiple arrays, and each related to one of the services that you provide with different captive portal APIs.
Okay. Eric Vink, I was about just, you said, Pierre, that you can get multiple PVDs for discovering multiple captive portals on the same network. Now, the captive API, I would not say the very detailed, cosmetic, empty string, put null.
Yeah. So what was your proposal, Tommy? You said there was a key that already exists in the API document, and or no, there is a long string, and we should use the same instead of an empty string or nil. Why not? Okay.
This is Daniel Kahn Gilmore. So as I'm thinking about this, I'm imagining connecting to a network where I get DHCP-v6 with Capport info. I get a route advertisement with Capport information. It also has a PVD information. I get the PVD, and the PVD gives me additional portal information. And I get another PVD, another RA, and I get another PVD. And some of those things point to the same things, and some of them point to different things. And I am really glad that I am not responsible for implementing this in a way that the user can understand. I think we are building ourselves a swamp that will have failure modes that are completely impenetrable. And that worries me.
Is this a problem that we already have with 7710 bis with the DHCP-v6 option?
Keep on digging. Did you want to answer that? As someone who is responsible for building implementation, I kind of with you. I mean, I think we're already sort of talking about, we're already talking about, 7710, and then, well, but like 7710 is hard, so let's do the location header. And that's actually, I almost feel that we should maybe just only do that first. And publishing a document doesn't automatically create a swamp. But it also, if it doesn't do anything, then there's no point in publishing it. So, I mean, we could either publish it and then, people will implement it or not, or wait until, let's say, the PVD work actually gathers a lot of steam. And when that is actually sort of mainstream and fully supported, we would just put it in there. I would almost say let's delay this until the PVD work actually goes in and becomes a standard and sort of wait on it. And yes, of course you can do this. Another thing that, of course, the PVD option does is it may or may not, depending on where this lands, have this containerized array option, in which case you can containerize the 7710 URL anyway. So yeah, we've got like this combinatorial explosion of ways of signaling captive portals. I would wait on this one, to be honest.
DKG again. So let me just ask a question that perhaps, okay, so maybe this is already specified, and I apologize if I haven't understood it properly. If I receive two different captive portal informations from one link, whether it's via PVDs or DHCP announcements or RAs directly or whatever, and they're the same thing, and I go to that captive portal API to register, what is my expectation as an endpoint? Have I registered to both of those things, or have I registered to one of them?
Right. So with the PVD is defined. Well, the PVD provides the tool to bind IPv4 connectivity and IPv6 connectivity together. So when you register to the one that is provided by the PVD, I would assume that you would have connectivity with both IPv4 and IPv6.
I got two PVDs. I connected to the network. I got two PVDs. They both gave me the same captive API. So I go to that captive API to register. Did I just register with both of them? No. Which one did I register with?
The one you used for your source address.
That needs to be documented.
Yeah, sure.
Tommy, so yeah, I really like DKG's point there. So yeah, this is not specified the multi-tenancy yet. One thing I'd be tempted to do is say, I don't know, like that they should not be the same, and maybe they can point to the same user portal, but be different APIs. So one thing that this brings up, and if Martin, you can take this in the notes, that we need to specify in the API document separately, is once you have interacted with the user portal and you think you are done, we do need to check in again with the API to see what the updated values are. I don't think it actually ever says that anywhere because, yeah, right. It's kind of important. So one thing you could imagine doing, like if they pointed to the same portal user interaction, and on that user interaction, I bought 2 out of 3 services, then ideally I should be able to check in with the APIs for those services or those PVDs and figure out which ones of those did the user just open up. So it's going to be some model like that if we go down that route. But even for the simple model, we do need to specify that we need to check in again to actually know what the user did.
So generally speaking, PVDs are sort of separate networks, right? So if it's not just the source address, it's, the DNS lookup. Let's say that I have a PVD host name of like, I don't know, okay, so it has to pass an SSL cert, so it's got to be a valid host name. But it could be like, login dot, whatever, captiveportal.login or whatever. I mean, yeah, probably not. It's going to be, or login.boingo.com, right? But they could be entirely separate, networks. And yeah, login for one wouldn't assume login for the other. You'd have to do a DNS lookup on both those PVDs and like an SSL connection on both of them if you wanted to log into both of them. How you present this to the user, of course, is basically tear your hair out because it's really very, I don't know.
I will say one thing that is interesting about having the Captive Portal API available via PVDs is that if the network is extended, say by tethering, it might be easier to discover that there's a Captive Portal there rather than having to have all the things that do the tethering and the tethering and the tethering and the previous delegation. Remember that they need to also pass along 7710 BIS URLs.
No, on the earlier point about having DHCP4, DHCP6 arrays, what's the current defined behavior with, you have dual stack network, you get an array with an option with the API and then DHCP with an API. Are you supposed to log into both, or do you assume that the IPv4 and IPv6 are bound together? You just need to connect to one. I mean, my point is to really defend PVD is that in the PVD spec, it is defined what it means to be bound, what an IPv4 and IPv6, how to bind them together.
So, if maybe I don't understand the question correctly, but I think what we should do, if we are going to use the PVD, right? So, I guess that's a good question. Is between if you also receive a DHCP option and a PVD. Now the DHCP option is going to be IPv4 only. Well, maybe v6, but v4, let's say. Now we have to give some. I don't have an answer. We have to give a clarification on which one wins, right? Especially if they are different Captive Portal API, if they are different endpoints, maybe.
I think the answer is if it's an implicit PVD, then they're all in the same PVD, and it doesn't matter if you use v4 or v6. Right? They're assumed to be the same network.
And actually, just thinking about it, I wonder what's the point of having a DHCP option overall, even for 7710 BIS. Why can't we just use an array?
So maybe what we want to, if we use this, we want to say is that if this is used and this wins, or that it should discourage 7710 being sent. Is that what you're saying?
Sorry, no, I didn't get it. Lorenzo was laughing too hard.
I was asking, are you suggesting that if PVD is being used, then PVD wins over DHCP option being sent? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, if you use, I mean, PVD solution would work as just by itself. You wouldn't need a DHCP v4 or v6 option.
But the question is, if it is sent, right? If the operator, they have already deployed 7710 and they forgot to turn it off, right? Now they deploy PVD, and now the UE gets both the DHCP, option and then the PVD. We have to give some. If we use this, we have to give some, tiebreaker, right?
Yeah, you need to define that.
Thank you. Got the answers you need.
So to the last one, I'm not sure. So I get that we should wait for the PVD work to progress, or
is everyone comfortable with that? Or that conclusion? As in, the proposal would be, Pierre would continue to work on this and make the improvements we discussed, but we would leave it as an individual draft until such time as we are more certain that PVDs are good, as in deployed or what have you.
So this raises a question for the architecture draft, which does explicitly mention PBDs in it right now. So does that mean I should probably just strike them from it until, so?
Do you need that?
No, I don't. I mean, it's more given as an example of a way of discovering the API. So I could probably remove it. Let's see what Tommy says.
Just to avoid not holding up your document being published, I would not down reference this document. What you could do is just bring up in the architecture that when you're supporting multiple networks, that this is not Wi-Fi specific, you can just have a reference just to the MPVD architecture saying that there may be needs in the future to specify captive portals also for discovered provisioning domains, which there may be multiple of on a network. And just essentially say that is a use case that this architecture could be useful for. And then this document, whenever it evolves, we just reference, and we are filling that role.
My impression is that this is Adam Roach. My impression is this is an informational reference right now. Down refs don't apply to informational, only normative.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, you can.
That's
you can
true.
Informationally reference a draft.
No, I think what Polly says. I'm so sorry, Tommy. Tired. I think what he says makes sense. And I'll do that.
I just wanted to remind the authors of the Capport API doc that we should decide what it means for the captive portal API URL to change. And okay, good, yeah.
Thank you all. Blue sheets, please. If you haven't signed in blue sheets, please sign the blue sheets. See everyone in Bangkok, perhaps? On the mailing list. Thank you.
55 minutes became 2.5 hours.
When you have it, why not use it?
Yeah, now or later? Now, oh, yes, then yes, I'm meeting someone for lunch.
I saw Marcus. It's a pretty good group, but we don't get a whole lot of activity. Like, he still believes in some grander scheme of signaling from the network to the endpoint is I think